We've got to fix.
Amazing.
A little more than 3 weeks from Election Day, Americans are glued to the polls. Maybe they shouldn't be.
A CNN poll showed that people trust Trump more on confronting terrorism, but they trust Clinton more on foreign policy.
When you read it reported in the media that poll says X is ahead by X points, what's the first thing you think of?
I question it.
Don Fall's leadership was forged on the battlefields of America's post-9/11 wars. Yeah! And returned home to find that the gratitude of a nation didn't translate to a job offer.
I would think people would be knocking down your door.
I found really universally that there was deep respect for what I had done. They just didn't think that the skills translated.
How you doing over here?
Another busy night along the waterfront in Boothbay Harbor, Maine. Tourists and locals flock here for some of Maine's famous seafood. Most don't know it, but there's one member of the waitstaff who quietly enjoys some special political pull.
And she said, well, who are you married to? And I said, the governor. She says, what governor? I said, the governor of Maine.
Welcome to Full Measure. I'm Sharyl Attkisson. Prepare yourself. These last weeks of the campaign will feature a rush of polls, each attempting to handicap the horse race and predict the presidency. More than ever before, companies, campaigns, and news outlets are seeking your opinion. There are landline polls, cell phone polls, internet polls, and push polls. And this recent average by Real Clear Politics, combining several polls indicating Hillary Clinton is taking a slight lead over Donald Trump. The margin of error puts them pretty close. But as much as Americans love to hear the latest predictions, we inherently question them. Today, we ask how honest and accurate the numbers are as we dig into the weird science of polling.
You say it's not a shakeup, but you guys are down. And it makes sense that there would...
Says
polls,
who?
most of them. All of them?
Sparring over election polls is an American pastime.
Says who?
Polls. I just told you, I answered your question.
Okay.
Are we being fooled by polls?
There are people that are trying to purposely mislead us. Then there are times where people just don't know better when they read part of the story.
John Johnson has a PhD in data from MIT. You could say he's an authority on the weird science of polling. And he says there's good reason to be skeptical.
So someone like you, when you read it reported in the media that poll says X is ahead by X points, what's the first thing you think of?
I question it. I looked to see what the sample size was, how many people. I looked to see who they questioned, and I looked to see if we actually, is there a track record for that poll? Those are the three things I think about first.
Tell us about the polls that intentionally mislead. How do they do that, and what is their aim?
The broad category of polls are called push polls. And so what a push poll is literally where you're masquerading as a pollster from an independent organization, but you actually represent a party or a political interest, and you're going to shape questions that are meant to influence the results.
I see my people, and as they're hungry.
There was allegations of push polling in Nevada, where right before the primary, calls to Bernie Sanders supporters sort of framed in terms of, well, do you realize that Bernie Sanders doesn't actually support Obamacare or this or these kind of hot button issues, and then asking, well, now would you still support Hillary Clinton?
Hillary Clinton says Bernie Sanders is making big campaign promises that will cost up to $20 trillion. As the Washington Post said, quote, realistically, his plans are dead on arrival in Congress.
Both parties are equally guilty. There's allegations of this, but that's what a push poll is. So that's just unethical.
Sanders accused Clinton of being behind the Nevada phone campaign, but her defenders denied it met the true definition of a push poll. Another non-scientific poll that's popular is the online instant poll that lets anyone vote, sometimes more than once. Donald Trump cited his victories in a number of those polls following his first debate with Hillary Clinton.
When we see what we think are the reputable national polls, you say there are issues with those too.
Yeah, there definitely can be. So first, I always think about, are they asking questions in a way that might be misleading or might be shaping the debate?
What are some examples?
So, for example, if you have a very long, complicated setup question, Donald Trump's position on Russia has been to show favor for Vladimir Putin, ... And then you ask a question about foreign policy and Trump, you're kind of guiding it. Or Hillary Clinton's email scandal continues to probe her or to haunt her. How do you think about that? Either of those type of things could guide the answer.
The latest NBC News SurveyMonkey online poll shows Hillary Clinton improving her lead on Donald Trump nationwide. She now leads 50 to 45.
She's up 5 points.
I looked at a poll recently that had Hillary Clinton up by a couple of points. But when I looked at the sample, they interviewed 50% more Democrats. So suddenly, it really didn't look all that positive for her to have interviewed 50% more Democrats, and she really wasn't winning by very much.
At the end of the day, every poll you see has some underlying model of turnout. And when you described, well, Clinton's up by 6, but there's a lot more Democrats in that poll, or you might see a different poll where Trump's up by 1, but there's a lot more Republicans in that poll, or they're weighted more. That's what's driving the results.
For people who think that maybe a pollster gathers 100 opinions randomly and publishes the results, there's a lot more to it.
It is not the case that we simply go and pick 100 people at random and they all answer the question and then we tell you, oh, out of the 100, 50 voted this way, 45 voted this way, 5 were undecided.
Historically, is there a poll or an average that's been right more often than the others?
Well, 538 has sort of credit for sort of being the one that's actually called most of the states correctly.
A CNN poll showed that people trust Trump more on confronting terrorism, but they trust Clinton more on foreign policy.
But 538 does something completely different. Again, they're an aggregator, they're not a pollster. So they take all the polls and based on the statistical precision, make some prediction.
People whose top issue is terrorism tend to prefer Trump.
The reality is you and I could sit here and go through the 50 states, and we probably together, not knowing a lot, could tell you how 40 of the 50 are going to work out, right? At the end of the day, the election's going to hinge on about 10 states. So then it's, well, are there certain polls within those states that are particularly useful? Monmouth has a very good reputation, for example. That's one. Now there's this advent of a lot more internet polling. Reuters Ipsos, YouGov, The Economist are doing more daily internet polls. So there's different choices at least. And I always say, well, let's look at it in its totality. But at the end of the day, I'm telling you, it's a handful of states is where it's going to matter. Ohio, Pennsylvania, Florida. Those are the first polls I look at.
The Leave vote beating the Remain vote in the UK. We are getting a Brexit, and financial markets around the globe are in panic mode.
Do any polling disasters stick out in your mind in recent times?
Brexit is a great example because that was really driven in part by difference between internet results and phone results and averaging polls together.
The total number of votes cast in favour of Leave was 82,000.
What was the bottom line?
They weren't representative enough of what the voters were thinking, and also they were too confident that people wouldn't change their mind, because a lot of people made a decision at the last minute.
Dawn is breaking on an independent United Kingdom.
The UK has voted to leave the European Union.
The great example, and this is not recent, is always Truman. But that was sort of a situation where they stopped polling 3 weeks before the election, right? And that showed Truman did sort of a bunch of whistle-stop tours and really built up support.
Are there any best polls and worst polls or organizations that have proven their accuracy or lack thereof over time?
ABC News Washington Post has done well historically, although this year there has been a little bit of a Democratic lean to those. Usually the ones that do poorly don't survive. There are some, as I said, notable examples of pollsters that have just been a little bit dishonest and usually get out of the way. There was one story I had read about 30% of Republican voters are in favor of bombing Agrabah. Agrabah is the imaginary town from Aladdin.
Public policy polling found 30% of 532 people who identified as Republican would bomb Agrabah, and only 13% saying, nope, let's not bomb the cartoon city.
A comment on the LA Times poll and the unique way they're conducting by interviewing the same people. What are they doing that's different, and what does that tell you?
They literally take a same set of people, it's called a panel, exact same people, and they interview them every day to try to measure the trends, who's changing their mind or not. The issue has been in part when they started, their poll sample, that underground group, skewed a little bit more towards Trump. So frequently, once you've set that, if you're going to interview the same people, that's going to be inherent in every single poll. The day that poll came out that Clinton was ahead, said, wow, that's a really interesting data point, because there's a group that has been predetermined, sort of seems to be skewing Republican. Now it's sort of shifted back, actually, with the tightening of the race again, and now Trump tends to be up.
Would you go so far as to say those big headlines on the national polls are relatively meaningless without that extra data?
It's an inherently complicated thing we're trying to do. The ultimate poll is the election. So I've got 100 people I'm going to survey. I've got 1,000 people. It's actually remarkable that statistics can even get it close. But as a result, that's a pretty hard problem to solve. You got to treat it as what it is. It's a pretty nuanced problem. Think hard about the polls.
Gallup, one of the nation's most respected polling organizations for decades, isn't polling the presidential race this year. Its final 2012 poll had Mitt Romney beating Barack Obama by 1 point. Gallup promised to fix what went wrong. Instead, it decided to drop presidential polling for the first time since its founding in 1935. Still ahead on Full Measure, it's a tough transition from the battlefield to the workplace. Lisa Fletcher takes a look at some business sectors that are finding value in our vets.